The colony ship Ardent Hope was not a warship. Anyone who looked at it could see that clearly. It had no weapons on its hull, no armor plating along its sides, and no military markings anywhere on its body. It was a slow, wide, round-bellied vessel built for one purpose only, to carry families from one world to another. It carried food supplies, farming equipment, medical pods, and the personal belongings of 400 people who had decided to start a new life on a distant planet in the Kepler Drift. Among those 400 people were 112 children. The youngest was 4 months old. A baby girl named Sona, who slept most of the journey in her mother's arms. The oldest was 17, a boy named Dex, who spent his days near the ship's observation windows, watching the stars and dreaming about what the new colony would look like. And between those two were dozens of other kids, boys and girls who played in the corridors, fought over food portions, asked endless questions to the ship's crew, and filled the long quiet of deep space with noise and laughter and life. Captain Rena Marsh had made this journey 4 times before. She knew the Kepler Drift well. It was a calm stretch of space, rarely traveled by military vessels, far from any contested border zone. There was no reason to be afraid. There had never been a reason to be afraid on this route. She was sitting in her command chair reviewing the next week's navigation schedule when the proximity alarm went off. 3 ships dropped out of faster-than-light travel less than 800 kilometers away. They were Vreth warships, long, dark, angular vessels that looked like blades hanging in the dark. They moved in a tight triangle formation, and they were already powering their weapons systems when they appeared. The Vreth were a reptilian species, tall, cold-eyed, and utterly without sentiment. They had been expanding their territory along the outer rim for decades, pushing into systems that the Galactic Concordat had long considered neutral. They did not ask for permission. They did not acknowledge borders they had not drawn themselves, and they did not, under any circumstances, consider the lives of other species to be worth much of anything. Captain Marsh sent the distress signal immediately, and then she sent it again on every frequency she had. She hailed the Vreth ships directly, identifying the Ardent Hope as a civilian vessel carrying no weapons and no military personnel. She gave them the full passenger list. She told them there were children aboard. The Vreth did not respond. What they did instead was something that would later be described in Concordat records as one of the most significant miscalculations in the history of interstellar relations. And the lead Vreth warship opened a broadcast channel, not to the Ardent Hope, but to the entire Concordat communication network. An open channel, one that every listening station, every government, every news relay across dozens of star systems could receive in real time. Then they attacked. The first strike took out the Ardent Hope's engines. The ship shuddered so violently that people were thrown from their beds, their chairs, their feet. Lights went red. The ship's emergency systems screamed. In the lower decks where the families were quartered, children began to cry. Parents grabbed their kids and ran for the escape pod bays, not knowing where to go, not knowing what was happening, just running because running was the only thing they could do. The second strike tore open the cargo section. The third knocked out communications from the inside. Captain Marsh tried to get to the escape pods herself, tried to help coordinate the evacuation. But the corridor she was running through lost pressure before she made it halfway. The Vreth continued broadcasting the entire time. They wanted the galaxy to watch. That was the point. The Vreth High Command had decided that a show of absolute dominance in neutral space would send a message to every species that had been quietly resisting their expansion. They wanted fear. They wanted submission. And they wanted every government in the Concordat to see what happened to ships that strayed into space the Vreth considered theirs, even if that space had never belonged to them at all. They got their broadcast, every word of it, every second of it. It reached the Thalori home system and was picked up by their deep space relay arrays. It reached the Concordat Central Station and played on screens in the main diplomatic hall, where dozens of alien ambassadors sat in stunned silence watching a civilian vessel being torn apart. It reached the Menaki Republic, the Sorvani Collective, and the Drath Federation, where government officials gathered around terminals with pale faces and wide eyes, and it reached Earth. On Earth, it was early morning in Geneva, where the United Earth Federation's central government was headquartered. The broadcast came in through the standard Concordat relay, flagged automatically by the monitoring AI as a Priority 1 emergency signal. Within 4 minutes, it was playing in the UEF Security Council chamber, where 12 people sat around a long white table and watched in complete silence. They watched the Ardent Hope take hit after hit. They watched the escape pods launch, some of them, not all of them. They listened to the fragments of audio that came through. They heard the children. No one at that table spoke for a long time after the broadcast ended. The UEF Supreme Commander was a woman named Admiral Dara Nkosi. She was 61 years old, with short gray hair and dark eyes that had seen 3 military conflicts in her career. She was not a person who was easily shaken. People who had served with her for decades said they had never once seen her lose her composure in a crisis. She sat very still at the head of the table for almost a full minute after the feed cut out. And then she stood up, walked to the communication terminal at the far end of the room, and opened a direct encrypted channel to every fleet admiral in the UEF Navy. Her message was not long. It did not contain strategic details or operational orders. Those would come later, in separate channels, through the proper military command structure. What she sent in that first message was something far simpler. It was an instruction. 3 words. So everyone in the Security Council chamber could see the message on the terminal screen before she sent it. A few of them closed their eyes. None of them objected. The message read, "Find them all." She sent it. Outside the windows of the Geneva headquarters, the sun was just beginning to rise over the Alps. It was a beautiful morning. Birds were singing somewhere below in the gardens. The city was waking up slowly, the way cities do on quiet days. Inside the chamber, the 12 people began the work of ending a civilization. Not loudly, not with speeches or declarations or angry broadcasts of their own. Quietly, carefully, with the focused, methodical energy of a species that had spent 10,000 years learning what they were capable of, and had spent just as long trying very hard not to show it. The Vreth had wanted the galaxy to watch them. They had not considered that the galaxy might watch back. 3 days after the attack on the Ardent Hope, the Galactic Concordat held an emergency session. The great circular chamber at Concordat Central Station was packed. Representatives from 41 species filled the tiered seats, and the air buzzed with dozens of different languages being run through translation devices. The attack had shocked everyone. Even species that had no particular love for humanity were unsettled by what the Vreth had done. Attacking a civilian vessel on an open broadcast channel was not just brutal, it was brazen. It was a message to everyone, not just to humans. The Thalori ambassador, an old being named Counselor Veith, opened the session. His species had been in space for over 2,000 years and had seen more wars than most civilizations could count. He spoke slowly and chose his words carefully, as he always did. The Menaki ambassador called for immediate sanctions against the Vreth Empire. The Sorvani Collective proposed a formal condemnation. Where 3 other species offered humanitarian aid for the survivors of the Ardent Hope. Everyone had something to say. The session went on for hours. The one group that said almost nothing was the humans. The UEF ambassador, a tall, quiet man named Director Harlan Voss, sat in the human delegations section and listened politely to every speech. When he was given the floor, he thanked the other species for their concern, acknowledged the aid offers graciously, and said that the UEF would review all proposals put forward in the session. He spoke for less than 4 minutes. He answered no direct questions about what humanity intended to do. He smiled when pressed, and said only that the UEF was currently assessing the situation. Then he sat back down and went quiet again. Several ambassadors exchanged looks across the chamber. This was not what they had expected, and they had braced themselves for fire. For human anger broadcast loudly across the whole station. Humans were known for their emotions, for their passion, for their noise. They cried openly. They shouted in debates. They sent long, impassioned statements to the concordant press channels at all hours of the day and night. But there was nothing. No statements, no press releases, no speeches. The humans were quiet. Councillor Veith noticed it first. He had been studying humanity longer than most, and he recognized the silence for what it was. After the session ended, he pulled aside a young Thalori aide who helped him manage communications, and he told the aide to begin monitoring all UEF fleet movements immediately. The aide asked why. Veith looked at him with old, tired eyes. "Because the last time humans went this quiet after a serious provocation," he said, "3 systems went dark before anyone realized what was happening." The aide began monitoring that same evening. What he found was not comforting. UEF warships were moving, not in the dramatic, visible way that a species prepares for open war. Not convoys massing at borders, not fleets lining up in known staging zones. The movement was subtle. Ships that had been docked at various stations for routine maintenance suddenly cleared their berths and departed without filing standard route declarations. Vessels that were supposed to be on patrol routes in human-controlled space stopped appearing at their regular check-in points. Supply transports began moving in unusual directions, quietly, without announcement. The human military was not gathering. It was dispersing, spreading outward through the dark between stars like something slowly uncurling in the deep. The aide brought his report to Councillor Veith at 2 in the morning, station time. Veith read it without expression, and then he sat alone in his office for a long while, staring at the star map on his wall. Far away from Concordat Central Station, in a region of space well outside Concordat-monitored territory, Fleet Admiral Yara Osei sat aboard the UEF flagship Unyielding and reviewed her operational orders for the 4th time. She was a compact woman with sharp eyes and the kind of stillness that comes from years of making decisions that other people's lives depend on. She had served in the UEF Navy for 32 years. She had fought in 2 conflicts and managed the peacetime coordination of humanity's largest fleet battle group. She was widely regarded as one of the finest strategic minds in human military history. She did not feel like a legend right now. She felt like a mother. She had 2 daughters of her own, 9 and 12 years old, both currently safe at home on Earth. She had watched the broadcast from the ardent hope in her private quarters. "I'm alone." And she had not let herself feel it until she was done reading her orders and had confirmed receipt to Supreme Commander Nkosi. Then she had sat for 10 minutes with her face in her hands. Then she had stood up, washed her face, and gotten to work. 14 battle groups had been assigned to her overall command. Each one was tasked with a different section of Vreth-controlled or Vreth-adjacent space. Their orders were not to provoke. Their orders were not to threaten. And their orders were to move into position quietly, identify every Vreth military installation, every warship, every supply depot, every command post within their assigned sectors, and wait. Just wait. Admiral Osei was not in a hurry. Hurry was for people who were afraid of losing. She was not afraid of losing. She was afraid of missing something, of leaving a target unaccounted for. So she gave her battle groups time. Time to move carefully, time to confirm positions, and time to make absolutely sure that when the order finally came, nothing would escape. The Vreth had 14 active military installations along the outer rim. They had 6 major fleet stations deeper inside their territory. They had 2 shipbuilding facilities that produced warships at a rate that had concerned Concordat analysts for years. They had a central command hub on a station orbiting their second-largest colony world. Osei had a battle group assigned to every single one of them. Back on Concordat Central Station, the diplomatic sessions continued. Sanctions were drafted. Condemnation resolutions were voted on. The Vreth ambassador appeared before the chamber and delivered a statement describing the attack on the Ardent Hope as a necessary security measure in response to what the Vreth called unauthorized entry into their sovereign space. Half the chamber erupted in noise. The other half went very still. Director Voss, the human ambassador, sat through the Vreth statement without any change in his expression. When it was over, a Menaki representative leaned over and quietly asked him how the UEF intended to respond to the Vreth's justification. Voss straightened his jacket and looked across the chamber at the Vreth delegation. "We already have," he said. The Menaki representative did not understand what that meant until 6 days later, when the first reports started coming in from the Outer Rim. Vreth Outpost 7 had gone silent. No communications, no beacon signal, nothing. A Concordat monitoring relay in the area had picked up a brief burst of energy consistent with weapons discharge, and then complete silence. Then Vreth Forward Station 12 went silent. Then Station 3. Then the fleet depot at the edge of the Kepler drift. One by one, like lights going out across a map, the outer edge of the Vreth military network simply stopped existing. No declarations of war had been made, no ultimatums had been issued, no warnings had been broadcast. The humans had not said a single word. They had simply begun. High Commander Sectaris had never been afraid in his life. He was a Vreth of the old military class, born into a family that had served the Vreth Empire for 6 generations. He had fought in 4 border campaigns and won all of them. And he had stood on the bridge of a warship while enemy fire tore through the hull around him and had not flinched. Fear was something he associated with weaker species. The soft ones, the emotional ones, the ones who cried and begged and fell apart under pressure. He had always looked at humans and thought of them as exactly that kind of species. He was beginning to reconsider. He stood in the operations center of the Vreth Central Command hub, at a massive station that orbited the second-largest Vreth colony world, and stared at the map on the main display screen. The map showed Vreth-controlled space, or rather, it showed what Vreth-controlled space was supposed to look like. In reality, the outer sections of the map were covered in red markers, each one representing a military installation that had gone silent. Some had stopped communicating hours ago, some had gone dark days ago. A few had managed to send brief distress signals before their communications cut out entirely. None of them had sent anything after that. The count was now at 11. 11 military installations, outposts, fleet stations, and supply depots. Gone. Not damaged, not disabled. Gone. When Sectaris had sent a scout ship to check on the first installation that went silent, the scout had reported back that there was nothing there. Not wreckage, not debris fields. Just empty space where a fully staffed military outpost had existed a week before. His chief strategist, a sharp-minded officer named Commander Veth, stood beside him and spoke in a low voice. "They are not fighting us, High Commander. They are erasing us." Sectaris did not reply. He kept staring at the map. He had ordered his strategists to model human military capability months ago, back when the decision to attack the Ardent Hope was first being discussed in the High Council. They had done their work carefully and thoroughly. They had cataloged every known UEF warship class, every weapon system humanity had developed, every battle tactic their military had used in recorded conflicts. The report had concluded that the UEF Navy was a capable fighting force, but not exceptional, strong enough to defend human territory, not strong enough to project serious offensive power at long range. The report had been wrong, not slightly wrong, completely wrong. And what the strategists had failed to understand was not the ships or the weapons. It was the people inside them. It was the thing that drove humans to do what they were currently doing. That deep, ancient, biological fury that activated when their children were threatened. The strategists had seen it as an emotional weakness, an irrational response, something that made humans unpredictable and therefore dangerous in the short term, but ultimately self-defeating. And they had not understood that for humans, protecting children was not a sentiment. It was a purpose. It was the oldest and most hardwired drive in their entire species, stronger than self-preservation, stronger than political calculation, stronger than the fear of consequences. A human would die for their own child without hesitation. That was well known. What was less understood was that a human would also die for someone else's child, for a stranger's child, for a child they had never met, and on a ship they had never seen, in a part of space they had never visited. The broadcast that the Freth had made, the one meant to show strength and inspire fear, had instead reached into the home of every human in the galaxy and activated something that no military strategist had ever properly measured. It had made it personal, for all of them, at the same time. Sectaris pulled up the archive files his intelligence division had compiled on human history. He had glanced at them before, but never studied them carefully. He studied them now. He read through them for hours, standing at his terminal in the operations center while his officers moved around him, and the red markers on the map kept multiplying. What he found in those files was not comforting. Humanity had a long history, a very long history of conflict, of war, of building and destroying civilizations on their own single world before they ever reached the stars. In all of that history, there's certain patterns repeated. Humans could negotiate, humans could compromise, humans could accept defeat and rebuild. They were, in many ways, a surprisingly adaptable and forgiving species. But there was a line. There had always been a line. When that line was crossed, when children were deliberately targeted, when the young and the helpless were used as weapons or destroyed as symbols, something changed in humans. The negotiations stopped. The compromises stopped. The forgiving stopped. Now, what replaced those things was a focused, patient, total commitment to making sure that the thing responsible for crossing that line could never cross it again. Sectaris found records of human conflicts throughout their own history where entire regimes had been dismantled because they had committed crimes against children. He found records of early interstellar encounters, cases that were barely mentioned in concordant histories, and small footnotes in old diplomatic archives, where species that had harmed human young during first contact situations had found themselves facing consequences that went far beyond anything those species had believed possible from such an apparently emotional and disorganized civilization. One of those species no longer existed. He had known that fact in a vague way. Most people in the Concordat knew it in a vague way. And nobody talked about it directly because there was something deeply unsettling about the subject, something that made even experienced diplomats and military commanders go quiet when it came up. The story was usually summarized briefly, in passing. The Qatari had made a serious mistake in early contact with humanity, and the Qatari were no longer around. Looking at the full file now, Sectaris understood why nobody talked about it in detail. The Qatari had been a mid-level spacefaring civilization with a military roughly comparable to the early UEF. They had encountered humanity during the first wave of human interstellar expansion and had, during a territorial dispute, destroyed a human settlement. The settlement had included children. The UEF at that time had been young. It had been small. By every measurable strategic calculation, it should not have been capable of doing what it did to the Qatari. And the calculations had been correct. The calculations had also been completely irrelevant, because humans had not fought the Qatari with strategy. They had fought them with something that strategy could not measure and could not stop. They had fought them with the absolute refusal to accept any outcome except a complete one. The Qatari were gone. Sectaris stepped back from the terminal. His hands, he noticed, were very still. He was controlling them deliberately. He turned to Commander Veth. "See, send a message to the Concordat," he said. His voice was steady. He was proud of that. "Request immediate emergency mediation." Veth nodded quickly and moved to relay the order. Sectaris looked back at the map. 12 red markers now. The humans had not stopped. They had not slowed. They had not sent any messages, made any demands, or issued any warnings. They were simply continuing, steadily, quietly, with no apparent emotion and no apparent hurry. That, he realized, was the most frightening thing of all. An angry enemy could be reasoned with. A grieving enemy could sometimes be appeased. But an enemy that had moved past both of those things, an enemy that had gone cold and quiet and simply decided that the job needed to be finished. That kind of enemy did not stop because you asked them to. That kind of enemy stopped when there was nothing left to do. He sent the message to the Concordat. Then he sat down for the first time in 2 days. I stared at the map and waited to see if anyone would answer in time. The Concordat delegation arrived at the UEF flagship unyielding on a cold gray shuttle that looked very small next to the massive warship. There were 7 of them. 1 representative from each of the 7 most influential species in the Galactic Concordat. They had been chosen carefully. Experienced diplomats, calm thinkers, people who had spent their careers solving problems through conversation. And they wore formal diplomatic attire and carried official Concordat credentials. They had prepared statements, legal arguments, and carefully worded appeals to reason and proportion. They had also, privately, prepared themselves to be afraid. Because the Unyielding was not just a big ship, it was surrounded by other ships, dozens of them, sitting in the dark in a loose formation that stretched across the region of space like a wall. No lights flashed on those ships. No signals were broadcast. And they simply sat there, quiet and massive, pointing inward toward Vreth territory. The delegation was met at the docking bay by a junior officer who was polite and calm and offered them water before leading them through the clean, well-lit corridors of the flagship. The ship was orderly. The crew members they passed nodded respectfully and went about their work. Everything was professional and controlled. That almost made it worse, somehow. There was no anger visible anywhere, no shouting, and no urgency, just people doing a job. They were brought to a wide conference room near the center of the ship. The table was long and white, the lighting was clear, and on one wall there was a large display screen that was currently turned off. They sat down and waited. Admiral Yara Osei came in 2 minutes later. She was not a large woman. She was not intimidating in the physical sense. She did not fill a room the way some military commanders did. She was compact and quiet. Now with short natural hair and dark brown eyes that settled on each person at the table for exactly 1 second before moving to the next. She wore a standard UEF fleet uniform with no extra decorations or ceremony. She sat down at the head of the table, folded her hands in front of her, and looked at the delegation. "Thank you for coming," she said. Her voice was even and calm. "I understand the Concordat has concerns." The lead delegate, a tall, gray-skinned Thalori named Ambassador Porath, spoke first. He explained that the Concordat was deeply troubled by the ongoing UEF military operations in Vreth-adjacent space. He spoke about international law. He spoke about the Concordat Charter and the provisions that govern the use of military force between member species. He spoke about proportionality, the legal and moral principle that a response to an act of aggression must not exceed the scale of the original act. He spoke for almost 10 minutes. He was very good at it. When he finished, O.C. nodded once. Then she reached under the table, picked up a small data pad, and placed it flat on the table in front of her. She turned it to face the delegates and slid it gently toward the center of the table. On the screen of the data pad were photographs, 112 photographs arranged in a grid. Each one showed a face, small faces, young faces, the faces of every child who had been aboard the Ardent Hope. Nobody at the table spoke. Alyosei let the silence sit for a moment. Then she spoke. She said that she had heard everything Ambassador Porath said. She said that she respected the Concordat and its processes. She said that she understood the concerns about law and proportion and precedent. Then she said that before they went any further, she wanted every person in that room to look at those photographs and understand exactly what they were discussing when they used words like proportionality. One of the delegates, a heavyset Menaki, named Representative Doral, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He said that no one was dismissing the tragedy of what happened to the people on the Ardent Hope. He said that the Concordat had formally condemned the Vreth attack and that sanctions were already being drafted. He said that the proper response was a legal one, carried out through Concordat channels, not a military campaign that could destabilize the entire Outer Rim. Osei looked at him for a long moment, and then she stood up and walked to the display screen on the wall. She turned it on. What appeared was a map of Vreth-controlled space, the same kind of map that Sectaris had been staring at in his command hub, covered in red markers showing destroyed installations. She pointed to each marker one at a time and named what it had been: a warship staging base, a weapons depot, a fleet repair station, a forward command post, a long-range missile platform. She went through all 12 of them. She did not speak quickly. She gave each one a moment. Then she turned back to the room. She told them that every single target her forces had hit was a military installation, not a colony, not a civilian station, not a population center. Every target had been a direct part of the Vreth military structure, the same military structure that had operated the 3 warships that destroyed the Ardent Hope. But she said that if anyone in that room wanted to explain to her how eliminating the military capacity of the species that deliberately killed children on a live broadcast was a disproportionate response, she would listen. She would genuinely listen. Nobody explained it. Ambassador Porath tried a different approach. He said that the Concordat was not defending the Vreth. He said that the concern was about what came next, that if humanity was allowed to continue unchecked, it could set a precedent that would make all interstellar peace fragile. Any species could claim grievance and use it to justify total war. Osei nodded. She said she understood that concern. She said it was a fair one. Then she told them humanity's terms. She spoke clearly and without rushing. Every Vreth military installation in the Outer Rim was to be permanently decommissioned and surrendered to Concordat inspection teams. Every Vreth commander who had authorized, planned, or participated in the attack on the Ardent Hope was to be remanded to a joint UEF Concordat tribunal. The Vreth Empire was to withdraw fully from all neutral territory they had occupied over the past decade, and financial reparations were to be paid directly to the family of every person killed or injured in the attack. She paused. Then she said, quietly but very clearly, that these were not starting points for a negotiation. They were conditions. And the difference between conditions and negotiating points was simple. One of them had flexibility built in, and the other did not. Representative Doral leaned forward and said that the Concordat could not allow one species to unilaterally impose such terms on another. He said it was not how the system worked. He said that, if humanity proceeded this way, there would be serious questions about humanity's place in the Concordat itself. Osei looked at him, and humanity was. She said that humans were humanity was. She said that humans were predators, shaped by millions of years of survival on a hard, dangerous world, capable of extraordinary violence when pushed to it. She said that humanity knew this about itself and had spent centuries building laws and institutions and agreements to keep that part of themselves in a box, because they understood what it could do if it got out. She said that the Vreth had not just crossed a line. They had reached into that box, in front of the entire galaxy, and deliberately broken something inside it. She looked around the table at all 7 delegates. "We are not asking for permission," she said. "We are offering you the chance to make sure this ends cleanly. If the Vreth accept our terms, the operations stop. If they do not, she glanced at the map on the screen, we keep going until there is nothing left to stop for. The room was completely silent. Then Ambassador Porath picked up his communication device and began composing a message to send back to Concordat Central Station. His hands moved quickly. Nobody argued with Osei again. Then the Vreth High Council accepted humanity's terms 71 hours after Ambassador Porath delivered them. There was no ceremony around the acceptance. No formal signing session, no diplomatic gathering, no carefully worded joint statement released to the Concordat press channels. A single encrypted message arrived at the UEF diplomatic office on Concordat Central Station at 3 in the morning, station time. It was short. It confirmed acceptance of all conditions without modification. And it was signed by the Vreth High Council's senior administrator. Not by any of the military commanders, because most of the military commanders who had authorized the attack on the Ardent Hope had already been quietly placed under internal arrest by the Vreth government itself. The High Council had watched humanity's operations against their military network for 2 weeks and had understood with perfect clarity that there was no version of continued resistance that ended well for the Vreth. Night Director Voss received the message, read it twice, and forwarded it immediately to Admiral Osei aboard the Unyielding. Osei read it in her private quarters. She sat with it for a moment. Then she opened a fleet-wide channel and gave the order to stand down. Across 14 battle groups spread across a vast stretch of space, human warships powered down their weapons systems, reduced their engines to stand by, and held position. The operation was over. It had lasted 19 days, and in that time the UEF had neutralized 14 Vreth military installations without a single formal declaration of war, without a single public statement of intent, and without the loss of a single human ship. The precision of it, the completeness of it, would be studied in military academies across the galaxy for generations. But the part that people would talk about the longest was not the military operation itself. It was the silence. The fact that humanity had done all of it without ever raising their voice, without ever making a speech, without ever once telling the galaxy what they were doing or why. They had simply moved and acted and finished, and then stood still and waited for the other side to make the only choice that was left to them. On Concordat Central Station, the mood was complicated. There was relief, genuine. A widespread relief that the situation had been resolved before it escalated into something that could have drawn other species into the conflict. There was also something harder to name, a kind of stillness that settled over the diplomatic community in the days following the Vreth surrender. Ambassadors and representatives who had spent decades in Concordat politics found themselves sitting quietly in their offices, thinking about things they had not thought about seriously before. The Councillor Veith of the Thalori spent an entire morning staring out the window of his chambers at the stars. His young aide came in to ask if he needed anything and found him just sitting there, very still, with an expression on his face that the aide had never seen before. The aide asked if he was all right. Veith was quiet for a moment. Then he said that he was fine. He said he was simply thinking about a question he had been carrying for a long time and had just now found the answer to. And the aide asked what the question was. Veith said that for years many species in the Concordat had privately wondered whether humanity was truly safe to have as galactic neighbors. Humans were volatile, emotional. They formed deep attachments, held strong opinions, and had a history on their own world that was full of violence. There had always been a quiet concern, discussed in private meetings and careful back-channel conversations, that humanity might one day become the most dangerous thing in the galaxy. The aide asked whether the events of the past few weeks had confirmed that fear. Veith shook his head slowly. He said that what the past few weeks had shown him was something different. He said that humanity was indeed dangerous. more dangerous than most species had fully understood. But danger was not the same as threat. A sharp blade was dangerous. It was only a threat if it was pointed at you. What the Vreth had done was reach out and grab that blade by the edge, deliberately, in front of everyone. And what humanity had done in response was exactly what any honest observer should have expected. He said the lesson was not that humanity was something to fear. The lesson was that humanity was something to understand. And the most important thing to understand about them was the thing that the Vreth had dismissed as weakness: the love they had for their children. That love was not soft, that it was not irrational. It was the most load-bearing part of their entire civilization, the foundation that everything else they had ever built was sitting on top of. Touch that foundation, and you touched everything. The aide thought about this for a while. Then he asked if the Concordat was going to change anything as a result of what had happened. Veith said yes. He said the charter revision had already been drafted. It would be voted on within the month. And he said there had been very little debate about it. The charter revision passed with unanimous support from all 41 member species. The new clause was formal and precise in its legal language, as all Concordat documents were. But in the hallways and meeting rooms and quiet offices of Concordat Central Station, diplomats and representatives referred to it by a different name. They called it the human provision, and what it said, stripped of all the formal language, and was simply this: no species would ever again deliberately target civilian populations, with specific and explicit protection extended to the young of any species, under any circumstances, for any reason. It was the first time in the Concordat's 300-year history that such a protection had been written directly into the Charter. Everyone knew why it had taken this long. Everyone knew what had finally made it happen. Nobody said it out loud, but it sat in the room every time the new clause was mentioned, plain and understood by all. While the diplomats finished their work on Concordat Central Station, a UEF recovery vessel called the Patient Star was making its way through the wreckage field in the Kepler Drift. The Ardent Hope was gone. What was left of it was a spread of debris that drifted slowly through the dark. Hull plating, broken equipment, pieces of furniture, are fragments of the things that 400 people had brought with them from home. The recovery crew moved through it carefully, documenting everything, collecting what could be collected. They had been searching for 18 days when one of the crew's long-range scanners picked up a signal. It was faint. It had been broadcasting on a low-power emergency frequency, slowly draining a small backup battery that had somehow survived. And the signal was coming from a cluster of 8 escape pods that had drifted together in the dark, pulled toward each other by their small magnetic emergency systems. The recovery crew reached the pods 4 hours later. They opened them one by one. All 112 children were alive. Sona, the 4-month-old baby, had been kept warm by 3 other mothers in the same pod who had taken turns holding her through the long, cold days of waiting. Dex, the 17-year-old who had spent the journey watching stars from the observation window, had organized the older kids to manage the pod supplies and keep everyone calm. He had made a list of everyone's names on the back of a navigation printout he found in the pod's emergency kit, and checked it every day to make sure nobody was missing. When the recovery crew opened his pod and the light came flooding in, Dex blinked at them and held up his list. Every name on it had a small check mark beside it. "All present," he said. His voice was hoarse and quiet. "Everyone is here." The recovery crew member who opened the pod, a young woman barely older than Dex himself, looked at his list. Then she sat down on the edge of the pod entrance and put her face in her hands for a moment, the way people do when something hits them all at once. Then she straightened up and got to work. High Commander Sectaris spent the weeks following the Vreth surrender in a holding cell aboard a UEF transport vessel. He was treated correctly, given food, water, a clean space, and regular communication access for his legal proceedings. The humans who guarded him were professional and said little. He had expected anger from them. He had expected coldness or cruelty, or at the very least the kind of visible contempt that a victorious enemy often showed. He found none of those things. They simply did their jobs and treated him the way the UEF's own regulations required prisoners to be treated. One evening, a young guard was stationed outside his cell door. The guard looked barely old enough to be in the military. Sectaris had been sitting in silence for hours, and finally spoke, more out of restlessness than any real expectation of an answer. He asked the guard a question that had been sitting in his mind for weeks. He asked why humans cared so much about their children, and not just their own, all children. He said that from a purely practical standpoint, the level of response that humanity had shown was far beyond what logic required. It was, by any rational calculation, inefficient and excessive. The guard was quiet for a moment. He looked at the floor. Then he looked up. "Because someone cared that much about us once," he said simply. "When we couldn't protect ourselves, someone chose to protect us anyway." He paused. "Oh, we don't forget things like that." Sectaris had no answer for that. He sat with it for a long time after the guard went back to his post. Outside, somewhere far away in the dark of the Kepler drift, the patient star was heading home with 112 children safe aboard. The stars were very bright out there, and the ship moved steadily through them, unhurried, carrying its cargo gently through the long quiet of space. The galaxy breathed out and remembered.